talk about invasive species in the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. Otherwise, we can have questions at the end of her presentation. Thank you, Annie.
The hazards of being a woman without a pocket. Okay. So can you still hear me when I talk straight ahead? Good. Yes, I can tell. So my name is Annie Simpson. Since the millennium. And this is a little bit, the slide tells a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me well or don't know me at all. I was trained as a biologist and got my Bachelor of Science from the State University of New York at Albany. And then from there, I went to University of Kansas in Lawrence, where I entered a master's program in entomology, which is the study of insects. During my time at Kansas, I was encouraged to experience the tropical existence, the tropical ecology experience. And so I signed up for a course in Costa Rica with an organization that's actually based at Duke University, the Organization for Tropical Studies. And I fell in love with the country and ended up staying there for 20 years. So I rushed back and finished my master's and went to live in Costa Rica. And I worked as a tourist guide there, and I worked in tourism management. Ecotourism is very big in Costa Rica. So I was using my field biology. Then when the millennium came, I had an opportunity to move here. And I moved across the street, the house right across the street, because my brother was abroad for a whole year. And he let me use his house for nothing. And let me tell you, that's a really good way to come back into a culture you've not been into for 20 years. I didn't have to pay rent. I was a single mom by that time. I had brought my 2 children, which is, one of them is named for the butterfly on this slide, Anartia Fatima. My daughter's name is Anartia. And my son was actually named for the former president of Costa Rica, Oscar Arias. So the 3 of us lived in that house for a full year, and we came here and we were welcomed. So this is why I'm here. And once I got here and got oriented, I actually got a job at the U.S. Geological Survey, first as a technical specialist, I think it was called. And then I became what I really am. They called me a biologist, and I retired a little more than a year ago as a biologist. While I was there for 20 years, I really worked the majority of the time on invasive species. The other reason that I include this slide at the beginning is that this is a species that many people would call invasive because, as you can see from this map, it's way down south. This is a piece of the United States. It's south. In fact, it's native to Central America. But there is a population that's established in Cincinnati. So that could be a non-native introduced species. But since I work for the federal government, we're big on borders, and it's native to southern Texas. So it's not considered non-native anywhere in the lower 48, if that makes sense. So let's see. This map was taken from the Butterflies and Moths of North America program, or BAMONA. That is a group that is very keen on taking data and using it and serving it to the public that is from scientists, from museums, and they also accept data of species occurrences from citizen scientists. So the next thing I'd really like to get into is a little bit of definitions. Invasive species are called by different things all over the world. They're called invasive species. They're called invasive alien species, alien invasive species. There's probably a few other terms. But the core of, in the United States, the core term is invasive species. And it was defined by an executive order in 1999 as all species that are non-native or introduced to an area, the ecosystem under consideration, that cause or likely to cause harm that's economic harm, such as on crops, or because you're trying to scrape them out of zebra mussels, scraping them out of power plant tubes. They're very expensive in many different ways. They cause economic, environmental, or human health harm. Also in 1999, the National Invasive Species Council was formed, and I worked with them for the 20 years I was at USGS. So even though invasive species are the ones that cause harm that are not native, they all start out simply as introduced species or non-native species. And we often don't know whether or not they're going to cause harm. There are intentional introductions, there are accidental introductions. So in the US, where they are introduced and have become invasives, they can be devastating. So how do they become invasive? Some are naturally well suited to a habitat and are simply strong and prolific. But many have additional advantages that are not immediately apparent. If they arrive in a new area or region without their parasites, if they're very healthy individuals and they don't come with their natural diseases, then when compared to native species that have diseases and parasites that they've evolved with, the new arrivals have a clear and distinct advantage over the native species. They often crowd them out, they outcompete native species, or they even prey on them. The next slide is one that everyone, I'm sorry. I've switched the order a little bit. So the next question I wanted to pose you and give you an answer to is, what kind of organisms become invasive? So the answer is all organisms. Viruses, for example, COVID-19, that started in China, so you could say it's native to China. It's devastating worldwide. For plants, the example I have on the slide, you can't see it very well. It's a very small picture of oriental bittersweet. Many of us know that because it's used very common for wreaths at Christmas time. But in the wild, it is overwhelming many natural habitats. The domestic cat, this one's controversial. We all love our cats. Well, keep them inside. Cats in North America single-handedly have devastated the natural bird population. How many times has your cat brought a little present back to you on your front mat? A dead bird. It is not pretty. Domestic cats have wreaked havoc all over the planet. Bacteria, the picture I have there is citrus canker, which is really hard on any citrus tree that you may have. Now, citrus trees largely are introduced here, but there are some native citruses, and the citrus canker is causing a lot of problems. The fungus example is Dutch elm disease. Many of you have gray hair like me. Remember when we were kids and we had a little street and the elms went like this? Well, they don't anymore. They're all gone. They've all been cut down because of this fungal disease. And likewise, another fungus that's devastating is chestnut blight. A colleague here recently, just before I started to talk, told me that this year they're hoping to reintroduce chestnuts that are blight resistant here in the United States. Cross our fingers. That would be really nice to see the chestnuts again. The other two groups are not real well known to most of us. Chromists cause sudden oak death. So if you have an unhealthy oak tree, it's very possible that it's got this It looks a little bit like a virus, it looks like a fungus, but it's a chromist, sudden oak death. And the protozoan example is Microsporium. It's a parasite common in aquatic situations. So how much damage can they do? Let's talk money. And how do invasive species compare with other expensive problems? They do much more damage on average than earthquakes do, as you can see on the slide. And remember, earthquakes aren't preventable, but invasive species are. It's up to us to try to prevent and try early eradication of invasive species. Invasive species tend to be overwhelming because they just come in massive numbers and reproduce fast and can really cause a lot of damage. There are also the non-native species that come in and just sit, maybe for decades, and maybe with climate change, when the weather changes, all of a sudden they wake up and start causing harm, which is the reason that in the 20 years I worked at Costa Rica in US Geological Survey, I studied not only invasive species, I took data about simple non-native introduced species because we want to track them to know where they are to be able to respond if they suddenly get the idea that they are going to be causing harm. Invasive species present an ideal case for support by citizen scientists, such as yourselves. If you're interested in nature, you could be considered a citizen scientist. With more eyes on the problem, more eyes looking to see what has come in, whether it's an insect or a plant or a disease on a tree, we have a much better chance of being successful in their prevention and their early detection. So invasive species is a geographic issue. I don't know if I've been clear about that. They're all native somewhere. Kudzu in Japan is a crop that's used to feed cattle and to make cloth and baskets. And green crabs, the European green crab, Europe is called the shore crab, and it's commercially fished. But here, kudzu is known in the US as the weed that ate the South, and that's not too much of an exaggeration. And green crabs attack and outcompete other local shellfish, and they also wreak havoc in eelgrass populations, which are important for sea life and sea reproduction. Little baby shellfish and baby fish hide in eelgrass. So if the eelgrass goes away, the life cycle of many species is disrupted. This is the slide I thought I had earlier, sorry. This is what is called the invasion curve. How many of you have seen this curve? Nobody. A couple. So if you've dealt at all with invasive species, this is flashed on the screens everywhere. And it's really pretty simple. It's very, it's logical and it's difficult. So I can't point, but I'm going to go up here. Here we've got the point of introduction of a species is here. And this is time. And as time goes by, the number of species goes up, right? Well, the cost to control those species obviously also goes up. So it's important and most cost-effective to prevent invasive species. And if you can't do that, it arrives using rapid response, hopefully citizen scientists who call out the fact that something has arrived. You can use a relatively small amount of money to exterminate a small population. But as time goes on, it becomes harder and impossible to get rid of the species. So we still deal with species that are very, very numerous and widespread, but in a whole different way. We set up barriers around things that are important to us to keep that really rampant invasive species out, for example. And it's much more expensive to do the kind of work we do after time has gone by. Okay. You may be wondering what is on the invasive species list for Virginia. So this slide, it's 2 columns. There are the not yet established plant species that we really should look out for. There is the not yet established animal species, which might be easy for some of us to look out for, if you're a plant person, animal person. Then there's some fungus species that are not yet here. Sudden oak death that I mentioned earlier is not here yet. The recently established species fall into the category we call EDRR, which stands for Early Detection Rapid Response. So if it's early in that cycle and the numbers are not really high, the cost to control or eradicate is relatively low. So those recently established species, we have some possibility of eliminating them. And then there's the few species that are very common and widespread, but they are devastating. So we're still spending some money to try to keep their effects to a minimum, or at least diminished. This is not the full list of invasive species in Virginia. These are the species that are being emphasized by the Department of Conservation and Recreation in Virginia. It's not a definitive list, but if you're interested in keeping an eye open and perhaps reporting some invasive species that you may have seen. Then the next slide is, these are the species that are actually banned in Reston. Now, this is a little harder to find than you might expect. It's about 10 kinds of plants, and the Reston Association, quite a while ago, put out in their notes, these plants are not allowed in the covenant of Reston Association, which means, so they came out in board meeting notes and old press releases, but there isn't a list on the web that you can just go to. Their being banned in Reston means that homeowners are not allowed to landscape with them, and they're encouraged to remove them wherever they are found. At least in theory, these plants cannot be sold in the local area. So I'm going to show you another map. This next slide is actually work that I did at USGS. I worked with a database that was talking about where all species are. And so we didn't really care whether they were introduced or not. We just took information in about all species all over the United States. And that project was actually called Biodiversity Information Serving Our Nation. It is now defunct, but as part of that project, I looked at the introduced species, which species were, I went to the literature. I forgot to tell you that USGS paid for my 3rd degree, which was in library science, because they wanted me to deal with data. I gladly dealt with data. I was very grateful to get a third degree, second master's, third advanced degree, I guess you'd call that. So I worked with an Excel spreadsheet and an awful lot of web lookups and databases from all over. And the databases that had general biodiversity information, but they might label the things as non-native. So I took that information and I created, goodness, what did I do? Oh, cool. So that's all right. So I created a list of invasive species, or non-native species, and then we merged it with all species, and we got this map. The darker counties, and you can see there's Alaska, most of Alaska. The southern piece of Alaska was not, there was a database issue with it, so it's northern Alaska. These dark islands is Hawaii, and then the conterminous 48 states, and those are divided up by county. So my list and the biodiversity databases, including from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and Bison, and iNaturalist. Some of you have contributed to iNaturalist, and Vamona, the butterflies, and so lots of different databases contribute occurrence information, basically saying this species was here at this time. And my database said, well, this species that's here at this time is also introduced. It's not native. So this shows the percent non-native species occurrences when compared to native species occurrences.
It's not invasive, it's called
non-native. Some of them are invasive and some of them are not. It's really hard when you get data to get the parameters you really want, because there's another thing that was taken into account. Hawaii is the most accurate one, but every non-native species there, for example, remember the Cincinnati butterfly? That's not on there. It's not on the Cincinnati colony because the border that was taken into account was the lower 48. So since it's native in Texas, it is not on the list. It's not taken into account. Yeah. Now, I'd also like to point out that there's somewhat of a trend. The darker counties tend to be either on the borders. Like, look at Florida. It's a port. So the ports are especially vulnerable to introduced species, non-native species. And also, some of the other dark areas throughout the lower 48 are urban and suburban areas that have been disturbed, and that tends to have more non-native or introduced species, including invasive species. So that's my work, part of my work. I did contribute my database to a global effort called the, if I can remember it, I'll come back. But there's a global invasive species, introduced and invasive species, the Global Register of Introduced and Invasive Species, GRIIS. You have a question? Wait a minute. Please, since we're on Zoom, we need you to speak into the mic. Say your name, please. Wait. Okay, now.
So anyway, one invasive species that I think has affected us here in Reston, and it's not really a very serious one, I don't think, is stiltgrass, and you had that on your list, Japanese stiltgrass. And we first noticed it 3 or 4 years ago, and it seemed to be growing every place. And you couldn't walk along a number of streets without just having stiltgrass up to your waist. Well, year by year, it seemed to start to die out. And I can only assume that the stiltgrass no longer was able to take the nutrition that it needed out of the soil. And who knows exactly why, but it seemed to today is much less of a problem, seems to be. And we can live with it very easily. And the other point so in other words, it adapts. And we understand that. But the other point is that there is a terrible invasive species, and we're all sitting here right now.
Oh, yes. I should have put that picture up.
Look at the United States in the last 3 centuries, 4 centuries, when humans started to, Indians first, and then Europeans came into the New World. Well, we know what happened. We had forests going from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, and you know how much we have left in the way of forests now, at least in the Appalachians, of course. And it's something that we really have to focus on more than anything else. But it's you can't talk about invasive species without focusing on the fact that we are the major problem.
Well, actually, we factor into the definition of invasive species. Any species that comes to a near area by itself is not considered non-native. It's natural range expansion. Part of the definition of an invasive species and an introduced species is that it is introduced either directly or indirectly by humans. And we are definitely the worst invasive species on the planet. I should have put them as the mammal example, not the poor kitten that we carry around. We carry that cat around. It's our fault, right? Thank you for that point, Roger. The next thing I have, I'm getting close to the end, don't want to keep you too long, is there's 2 slides with references, since some of you may be very interested in looking into this further. For general information, I really suggest the national website, It's from the National Invasive Species Information Center, and this website is maintained by the National Agricultural Library. So it does have some agricultural bent, but it also covers ecosystems that are natural ecosystems and aquatics. Then for upcoming activities, at the end of this month, if you want to take part in National Invasive Species Awareness Week, that's the 28th of February to the 3rd of March, I believe. I didn't write it down, sorry, but it starts on the 28th of February, and we have 29 days, so it's 2 days in February and 2 or 3 in March. It's Monday to Friday. And this is when citizens, scientists, and anyone who's really interested can interact with members of Congress to update them and ask them about what they're doing and what the problem is currently with invasive species. And if you'd like to get a very local perspective, the third one is sort of a controversial link. There is a group that has looked at the invasive plants near our golf courses, and that is the link to this group. The second sheet of, oh, wait a minute, did I go too far? Yes, I'm sorry, I went too far. So this was the first one. That's where it talks about it's the 26th of February to 3rd of March, and the Reston group. I was showing you the wrong slide, I apologize, because I saw me over there. So that's the first three, and these are actually specific to Virginia, these three. The invasive plant website, the invasive plant list, which again is not official. It doesn't have any regulatory teeth. Some places, such as New Zealand and Australia, there's very strict regulations and there's fines and all kinds of things to try to keep invasive species out. I meant to mention, I hadn't, that globally we have found that islands are particularly vulnerable to invasive species. Remember the map I pointed out that Hawaii has 33% introduced species? So they're vulnerable because the native species don't really have any place to go when a non-native comes in and starts being invasive. So the islands are like a case study, and New Zealand, which I mentioned as being very strict, is basically an island nation. The last list is from the National Invasive Species Center, which I mentioned previously, National Agricultural Library, but that list is Virginia. So these are referenced specifically about Virginia. Some of them are maps, some of them are organizations, some of them are specific invasive species that are new in the state. So this slide I put in because of the title, obviously, and because you're Unitarian Universalists. The interdependent web of all existence requires our respect to be able to function normally. We have damaged many, if not all, of our ecosystems on this planet in many ways, and not the least of those ways is by introducing invasive species and disrupting the natural web. When we hurt something by our actions, we need to at least try to make good and make reparations. Invasive species science is doing that, sometimes out of respect for the interdependent web, but sometimes simply for selfish reasons. When species are highly damaging to our livelihoods, our economy, or our health. The bottom line is, to me, this is an important area of biological science that is also a very difficult and challenging one. So, 3 more slides, real quick. We'll come back to that point. We will, okay? The news flash, if you are interested in doing something, the most wanted dead insect right now is the spotted lanternfly. It's new to Virginia. It was started in Pennsylvania and is spreading rapidly. But in Virginia, it's still early on that time curve, so we have a chance to eradicate it. It's an early detection, rapid response species. This species, the spotted lanternfly, is neither a fly, nor is it a moth, even though it looks like a moth, don't you think? It's not a moth. It's a true bug in the order Hemiptera, entomologist speaking here, and it's related to cicadas, which, by the way, we're going to have big cicada outbreak this year too. So, but I don't think you'll confuse that with a cicada. So it shows this image shows all of its life stages, and the most effective stage to control this insect is unfortunately also the most difficult to see. It's the egg mass. They may appear on the trunks of its intermediary host, which is the tree of heaven, also an invasive species. Or the egg masses may be stuck to a vehicle if you've been camping somewhere or if you've left the vehicle parked for a long time. So check your vehicle periodically. Give it a good wash. Try to scrape these bugs off. And for more information about, this is a link to a fact sheet about spotted lanternfly in Virginia. This is from a website that is run by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And that's what I've got. Let's go into questions or comments. And Lori, you're first. I believe you're going to be talking about the interdependent web of all existence.
No, I'm going to talk to you about an even more local opportunity to control invasive species. Our church grounds are overtaken by an Asian wisteria. It's not in this picture.
No, this is an old picture.
But if you look at the walkway, the sidewalk that leads up from the parking lot, you know those tendrils that try to reach out and grab you as you walk by, we cut them back now and then, are invasive Chinese wisteria, which can climb trees and strangle the trees and kill mature trees. Last year, on behalf of the garden group here at the church, I applied for a grant to remove the Chinese wisteria from the church grounds. There were 10 grants available and 42 groups applied. So we were not in the first awardees, but I understand that we are being considered. You know, they're hoping to expand the program. So we've got our foot in the door. And if we are able to win this grant, it would require the church congregation to donate the best way is to donate hours of volunteer time to help with the effort. And if we donate 50 hours of volunteer time, we can qualify for $3,000 grant because some of these, you can cut off the top growth, but of course the roots underground will survive unless they are treated with serious herbicides. And it would be best if we hire professionals to do that. So I'm hoping to have news for you about removing invasive species from our own property. The other thing is that in the state of Virginia, you know, our General Assembly's meeting now, there's several bills there related to invasive species. And so there's one bill that would allow localities to outlaw the sale of English ivy, okay? And so Paul Kryzak of Northern Virginia is sponsoring that. There's another, you know, the problem with fighting invasive species, there are some states that have already outlawed named species. As Annie mentioned, the Virginia invasive species list, actually the ones that are certified is way low. There are a lot of, so there is from 2018, there was a vote to renew the study of invasives. And so there is a group that's trying to add more invasive species to the Virginia list. But the bill that's in the legislature now would augment that and require that at the point of sale, there are still invasive species for sale. So even though I'm working to remove English ivy from mature trees that could be killed by it, my neighbor can go buy English ivy and plant a new. I guess not in Reston. In Reston, you can't plant English ivy. Now, who's policing that? I don't know. I'm on the RA board. I know we cannot force people to remove what they have. But anyway, there are steps towards studying and labeling at the point of sale species that could be invasive and letting people know that this is a plant that can cause harm and there are alternatives. The reason it's not an all-out ban is because there is a nursery industry that still profits from selling these plants that opposes any steps to ban these plants. And so, I've made a visit to the Virginia General Assembly this year to lobby legislators on these bills, and if anyone's got an interest in it, I can share information about bills that have made it through the committee stage and are possibly going to be up for a vote again in the future. But again, in Virginia, we are very early in the stages of trying to regulate invasive plants, and I'm hoping that this is a movement that will grow, because as I spoke to legislators, even some Republican legislators said, why are you just asking for signs? Why don't we ban these plants? And we said, are you going to be on board to offer a bill next year? So a lot to do locally on that.
Thank you for the comment. Thank you.
There's a comment back there, or a question?
Yes, Bob.
Annie, what I'm wondering
Please
is...
state your name, Bob.
Oh, I'm Bob Anthony here.
Thank you.
What I'm wondering is climate change is causing a radical shift in the viability of various ecologies at various latitudes. And it also allows particular mosquito species to migrate further north and so forth. I was wondering, is there a lot of people looking at the interplay between climate change and the shifting environments that are going to be associated with that, and the shifting balance of species, and whether entire ecologies can move in time to be able to maintain any sort of balance of their natural system. And specifically, I worry about trees, that if things move too quickly, the areas where the trees would be viable are not yet seeded, and the areas where they exist in numbers, they may be in severe danger of not being able to sustain themselves.
It's a very complicated and complex issue. We talk about every organism on the planet has species in it that are invasive. Plants, perhaps, is the largest following of invasive species science. I am retired, but I came out of retirement for 2 days last week because there was a conference for the first time where invasive species scientists met with climate scientists to talk about what's next. What are invasive species going to get worse in these areas? Do we need to think about supported migration of species to new areas because where they live now is no longer suitable habitat for them? And the answers are, like I said, they're complex and as yet unknown, because we have issues they're legal issues, there's emotional ones. When Lori was talking about certain plants that we're taking out, there are people here in Reston who love their English ivy and burning bush, and there are things that are introduced that are well behaved. There really are. There's the majority. I don't remember if I gave this statistic, but in a natural ecosystem, of every 100 organisms that are introduced, only 10 become established, and only one of those will become invasive. So it's a 1% average in an ecosystem conversion from introduced species to invasive species. Climate change may be changing those statistics. That's an average. You take the numbers and you take them, but our changing world is changing the reaction of the species in it. And we need to meet with many different scientists together to figure out what we can do. There's the scientists say we can fix the climate change issue if we just inject carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It will cool things down. And there are people who really want to do that. And then there's others who are saying, oh my gosh, we're manipulating again. It'll be like the cane toad that was introduced. Remember the big giant toads that were introduced into the South Pacific for the mosquitoes? They ended up eating every insect. So you have to be careful what you do, that doesn't affect more than you want it to affect.
I'm sorry for the invasion of English ivy, but when I was a kid in England, we had our pretty, beautiful red squirrels, and they were invaded by gray squirrels from the United States or America
Yes.
anyway.
Gray squirrels are
And they
invasive
took
over there.
over.
Absolutely.
And poor red squirrels, they almost died out. I don't know. So,
Yeah. Another invasive from here to elsewhere, there's several of them. The red-eared slider turtle in Japan has replaced all the native turtles. We just outcrowded them. The raccoon, we know it's a naughty actor, but it's really invasive in other places. So,
Any more questions or comments? If not, let's thank, oh yes, one over here.
one more.
One moment, wait.
Roger Lowen. Thank you.
We
Talking
didn't
about
hear you. You have to say it again.
I'll make it very short. but
No, say
talking
your name
about
again. Each time we have not heard your name. Say it again.
Roger Lowen.
Thank you.
Talking about English ivy, about some 30 years ago, we had a member, a senior member, who probably I would think was a younger member today, but he was moving, and he very generously told me we could go to his house and dig up as much English ivy as we wanted, and, which I did, and it did fairly well, but now it's sort of dying out on its own. I thought that was
It can happen.
English
Yep.
evolution, a very interesting evolution.
You mentioned the way populations go up and then go down. Stilt grass was the other example you gave. The things that may come into play on that are, like you said, the nutrition in the soil, and it could be that one of their natural enemies caught up to them. Things are introduced repeatedly to an area. It's very rare that something is introduced once and it establishes and takes off. So sometimes populations that are invasive will start to go down because a native disease catches up, or their disease that they had comes in with a subsequent introduction, if that makes sense. So.
Very much for a very interesting presentation.